The Scream Kings are in no way responsible for any encounters with the paranormal, extraterrestrial abductions, eldritch insanity, hauntings, curses, hexes, demonic possessions, cryptozoological sightings, or any loss of sleep that may result from listening to this podcast.
This is the Scream Kings podcast. I'm Max George.
And I'm Nathaniel Darkish.
For them, an idyllic summer afternoon drive became a nightmare. The events of that day were to lead to the discovery of one of the most bizarre crimes in the annals of American history, the Scream Kings podcast.
Okay, that has to be one of our best intros. And speaking of intros, let's introduce who also is in the room, or I guess reintroduce in this case.
And room, we mean the waves of podcasting.
Yes. The virtual recording space.
The one and only Andy Scahill joins us again.
Hey guys, well, I'm happy to be back. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we are so thrilled that you were willing to join us again. And along those lines, because you are, I guess, one of the only people who has been on the podcast twice, we wanted to, as Scream Kings, knight you as a Scream Knight, I guess.
Ooh, exciting. Templar.
Yes.
Well, don't get too crazy, Andy.
Ratchet it down.
I just crossed myself while we were knighting you. I know podcasting isn't a visual medium, but I did that just, for some dramatic flair.
But an upside down crossing.
Obviously, yes.
Oh, well, I'm not a Christian, so obviously.
So Knights of the New Order. Got it.
That's right.
Well,
Knights of this Rosy Cross.
I feel coordinated. Thank you.
Yeah. So today we wanted to talk about, of course, one of the most important horror films of all time, the 1974 classic by director Tobe Hooper, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
This is the movie that is just as real, just as close, just as terrifying as being there.
Originally, Nathaniel and I were just going to tackle this movie, but I reached out to Andy because you were so insightful in our last episode and asked if you had any thoughts or opinions on Texas Chainsaw, which resulted in a, I think, 20-minute discussion about how you needed to be a guest on this because it's one of your favorite movies and you teach it in a lot of your classes and it's very dear to your heart. So we're excited to talk about this with you.
Yeah, and it's a movie that I love to talk about. I love it because it's one that I think most people just think of as kind of a like throwaway slasher, but it has so much depth to it and so much of a time capsule, this film.
So I do think that the movie is so iconic, we don't really need to go over any kind of plot summary. And kind of how we have our strategy here is let's talk about why this movie is so important. Andy, you've given me loads and loads of details, which I've tried to document to talk about. But first off, you mentioned that this is one of the most disturbing and violent horror films in the history of cinema. Talk to us about that. Why do you think that?
I mean, it's disturbing for sure. You know what's crazy about Texas Chainsaw Massacre? And again, if you ask somebody about this film, they will think that it's just a splatter gore fest where it's all about just bodies being chopped up on screen. What's amazing about this film is that you don't actually see any penetration of bodies. And people think they see a lot more than they actually do in this film. And so it's actually really sparse with its kind of use of violence in an almost like antithetical way.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, they were going for the PG rating, weren't they?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And but it's amazing what this film does through suggestion and through sound design and set design to just give that overall impression of just grime and dirt and just a sort of filth is what I kind of step away with this film. It's just a dirty, raw film. And that's the impression that sticks with me.
And that's something that I think is super important when it comes to Texas Chainsaw. A lot of people, like you say, they think of this movie, they've seen Leatherface, you know, he's very popular in spook alleys and haunted houses and corn mazes and whatever. I mean, the chainsaw is technically his weapon of choice, you know, it's become so developed into our zeitgeist. But the grime and the dirt and the shots of this film, I think, is where the true horror is, and we'll get a little bit more into the kind of the political environment that this was staged in. But
yeah, I mean, here's my crazy memory of the film is I remember watching this as a kid, and the most terrifying moment in this film was not the slaughter parts, it was picking up the hitchhiker in the van and watching him cut his hand. And just the way that actor looks was so disturbing to me, and that's what stuck with me. I remember having nightmares about just that guy in the van cutting his hand. It was so disturbing to me.
So the movie was produced on a very low budget of only like $300,000, and it's gone on to be, again, one of the most iconic horror films ever, on par with, you know, Jason and Freddy Krueger and Pennywise. Tell us a little bit more, though, about kind of the subplot and the undertones about the movie. You and I talked a lot about the Age of Aquarius and the Vietnam War and all of this really deep mythos behind it.
One of the really great things to look for if you watch the film again is that the mise-en-scène in the film is all red, white, and blue. And it favors all of those colors. It's Tobe Hooper's kind of anti-war sentiment. And we open the film with this group of hippies who are driving across the country in this van. And, you know, she's reading an astrology book. And this is a film about Mercury going into retrograde, right? It's about the end of the Age of Aquarius. And I think it's a really pointed kind of statement. If you guys remember that song, I went ahead and pulled up the lyrics of the Age of Aquarius because I think it's kind of really important. Where did I put that?
And for those of you who might not understand what the Age of Aquarius is, just for some syntax, it's kind of this almost nirvana state of sense where there's this idyllic time, everyone's friendly, very much rooted in kind of the counterculture that was developing in the 70s.
Absolutely. And there's this song, Let the Sun Shine In, from Hair, where it says, peace will guide the planets, love will steer the stars. This is the dawning of the Age of Aquarius. Harmony and understanding, sympathy and trust abounding, no more falsehoods or derisions. And this is the end of that, you know? This is like the end of the hopefulness of the 60s. And we're now entering this new era where all these young, hopeful people are just going to be consumed literally by the past. And that's terrifying.
And I oddly think that this movie has a lot of poignancy to what's happening in our country today. I feel like in some regard, you know, whether it was intentional or not, I think America was in some sense in an age of Aquarius before COVID and Trump and all of this. And now we're kind of face to face again with a lot of the horrors that our society has just allowed for so long.
Absolutely. I mean, this film is, to me, a progressive nightmare. And, you know, much like, well, I mean, Obama campaigned on hope. That was his message, right?
Yeah.
And now we have what I would say is this sort of revenge against that hopeful generation. And the same thing is happening in this film. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is about the fear of young people that the time of hope has ended, and now the past is kind of taking over. And this has so much to do with the Vietnam War, right? Where it's young bodies who are basically cattle for the slaughter for a war that their parents created. Right? And I mean, that's the history of warfare, right? Is young people paying for the wars that their parents created.
And, you know, of course, along those lines, you know, then it's no coincidence that it spends so much time talking about slaughterhouses and talking about, you know, that you know, grandpa of the Sawyer family is, you know, he was the best at being someone in the slaughterhouse, you know, and along those lines, you know, you kind of can connect that to probably, you know, that he may have been a vet in a different war or something like that, or at least that's the kind of the suggestion there, that, you know, he would, what does it say, that he killed 60 cattle in 5 minutes, and he could have done more if the people were faster at getting the cows out of the way. And so I find that really a horrifying image that definitely talks about how there is so much death that is just so readily available. But
Mm,
another thing that I was seeing in a lot of my research about the film, just kind of prepping for the episode, was the ways that it brought up how um, this film is sort of a critique of just all of the ways that the government has lied. Especially like with the oil crisis and stuff like that was going on or around the time. And I find it funny that again that you can draw a direct connection there with them getting lied to about the gas tanks and gas is coming later today, and but then the movie itself lies to you, which is interesting. That opening card saying like this is based on true events is bullcrap.
I think one of the greatest things that Texas Chainsaw does is oftentimes people think of the horror genre as just kind of this garbage, turn your brain off and not think kind of a movie. You want to get scared, you want to see the jump scares, but what a wonderful platform to take some of the most horrific things that are going on in the country during the 70s and during now, and creating a narrative that speaks to so many people in such a profound way. Texas Chainsaw for me is one of the dirtiest looking films I've ever seen, and until you kind of step back and think about the plot, it has so much deeper meaning behind it, even more so than Leatherface and serial killers, and it's beautiful, which is odd to say because it is such a gross, horrifying film.
for sure. And we talk about what did this film do to kind of set the standard for the slasher? Not just the final girl, not just the terrible place away from home, not just the killer with a phallic weapon, but it's really the start of or using generational conflict as its engine. And this will really set the template. It's young people paying for the mistakes of previous generations. And the murder here is senseless. These kids didn't do anything to deserve this. And that's really the kind of feeling of, I would say, that the young generation at this time is why are we dying? What did we do to deserve what we've inherited, essentially?
It's also such a powerful movie because it is based a lot around the quote-unquote serial killer, even though he's not really a serial killer, Ed Gein. And this really laid the foundation for many, many slasher-esque movies to come. Silence of the Lambs and Buffalo Bill, Psycho, Three on the Meat Hook, Deranged, Child of God. It really is interesting to me that the character of Ed Gein, who we'll get into a little bit later on in the podcast, was kind of this foundation for horror slasher movies. It's just interesting because if you look at Ed Gein from kind of a psychological standpoint, he's a lot less scary than a lot of other serial killers out there. And in some regard, his story was a bit tragic. So it's interesting how the times can shape someone to be something that they're not.
I think you talked about Ed Gein's connection to Psycho, and certainly that film is using his story. But both Psycho and Texas Chainsaw Massacre use taxidermy in kind of interesting ways to kind of represent these people's inability to move forward. Right?
Yeah.
These are people stuck in the past and unwilling to kind of move with modernity. And you definitely see it with Norman Bates' preservation of his mother, his inability. He says we're all caught in our little traps, right? In Psycho. In Texas Chainsaw Massacre, what I find so compelling is that Tobe Hooper makes essentially the nuclear American family as the thing that keeps them in stasis. And they're so obsessed with recreating this Norman Rockwell-style dinner party in the most macabre way.
Well, and it also, I think, kind of lends way to thinking about kind of the modern family then and now, and how this construct of modern family almost becomes a vice where you can't see past, a heteronormative parent structure and the children, and if anything deviates from that, it's bad. And again, just talking about this more and more makes me love this movie so much more. Wow. Anyway.
Yeah, one interesting thing is, a lot of critics have looked at how they dress Leatherface in essentially drag, right, in this film. And, there's a lot of people talking, is this transphobic? What is this? For me, it speaks to this family's obsession with the need to have the nuclear family, to the degree
Right.
that they dress Leatherface almost up like the mother in order to have that image of, the Norman Rockwell dinner table.
And I think it harkens back to Ed Gein as well,
Uh-huh.
his desire and want to dress and essentially feel
Mm-hmm.
like a woman.
Mm-hmm.
Nathaniel, anything you wanted to add there? Should we move into kind of the pros of this movie more so than what we've already talked about?
Well, just another thing that we've only kind of touched on is just like the impact that it had, I think, on a lot of the other filmmakers of the era. You definitely look at like Wes Craven and John Carpenter and a lot of these other big filmmakers, and looking at how like Wes Craven, I is quoted as saying something along the lines of that he didn't know that you could do that in a movie. And then shortly thereafter, he began his film career, and then his first film was Last House on the Left, which is a similar level of depravity, I think, in terms of the grittiness of the film. And so I just think it's really interesting to see how in many ways this kind of set up that so many of the archetypes, and we've touched on that already, but just that not only did it set up a lot of the kind of the slasher tropes, it also did a lot just to simply inspire a lot of the other filmmakers of the era. And then just another thing that I find really interesting about this movie, before we kind of start digging into the plot and stuff, is that in many ways, Tobe Hooper intended it as a black comedy, which didn't really come through. Which is why he then went on to make Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, which is very overtly a comedy, to the point that it the poster is a parody of The Breakfast Club. Like it's just so interesting to see how even like this particular film stands apart, I think, from the sequel films and all of that, in terms of its intent, in such an interesting way that its direct sequel is very silly and over the top, while this one still gives you so much to kind of more stew over. And I would say that in many ways this doesn't come across as a black comedy. To me, this just comes off as social satire, but in just a straight up horror way instead of a comedic way. It's atypical.
Yeah, I agree. And there are moments when you feel that almost parody of the American sitcom, when he, puts the chainsaw through the door and he's like, "Yo, you, what'd you do to my door?" It feels very much like a kind of a, early sitcom kind of moment. But you're right, they're far and few between. And to me, those moments kind of add to the perversity of it.
Okay, well, so yeah, let's launch on into some of the specific elements of the film that we really enjoy, that we feel works especially well. And I'll kick us off just by saying that I really like the setup of the film. Just the discussion of the grave robbing, just kind of coming over the radio, and the really jarring shots of these corpses that ends up being like a bizarre, horrifying piece of art, and then that gives us a reason for these characters to be there. They're going to just make sure that their grandpa's grave didn't get disturbed, and then everything rolls out of spirals out of control from there. But the first image is it's a corpse with another corpse's head just kind of coming out of the chest.
Yeah, I mean, this family is so strange, right? Because there lots of reasons, but where I'm going is
I was gonna say that's like the nicest way to put it. They're just so strange.
It's strange in that they're not the sort of typical horror. They create art, which is really weird. Do you know what I mean? I'm trying to think of another film in which like the monster creates art, and it's just a strange combination of deep inhumanity and yet the most elevated form of humanity, right?
Yeah, I mean, like the only other thing that's really come to mind for me is the Hannibal TV series. The way that Hannibal will stage it, like grafting a body into a tree or something like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, and maybe like Jeepers Creepers, but yeah, I mean, it's if I approach this film from like say an eco-critical perspective, one of the really like strange, disorienting things it does is that it forces me to think of human bodies the way that we treat animal bodies, right? It forces me to think of human skin as leather, essentially. Forces me to think of human bodies as, furniture or art, the way that we would hang like a steer head on the wall, you know what I mean? And not think a moment about how perverse that is.
Or meat.
Yeah, absolutely.
The
Absolutely.
barbecue is definitely, human flesh. There's so much that is, in a way, like you can see their perspective as simply just, looking at humans as just something that's supporting their way of life.
And because of industrialization, I don't have to think about how we kill a horse, melt down its hoof in order to make, whatever. But this film forces me to think about those things, right? Like, because I'm so removed from the production of products that I use every day that require the slaughter of animals, I don't have to really think about those things.
I think another aspect of the movie is the character of Leatherface. I love how this man, and I really think that gender neutral kind of serves him as well, is portrayed, of course, as the villain. He becomes an iconic horror villain, but the backstory is so clouded in mystery, you really have no idea the intention, the purpose, the drive for anything he or his family is really doing. And I love the mask that he wears because, one, it's just so damn jarring, and two, it kind of creates this level of inhumanity about him, that he's a monster, not a real human. And I think it ties to what both of you were just saying. It kind of forces down our throats that humans treat each other like monsters. Leatherface is a human.
And I would say he's even like a child in this film.
Yeah.
He is certainly abused by his father, and he howls like a child many times throughout the film.
Yeah, I know that Gunnar Hansen specifically talked about that in order to prepare for the role, because when he read the script, he saw Leatherface as being mentally deficient, and so he went and observed a lot of special ed classrooms and stuff like that before he came and he performed as Leatherface, because Leatherface really isn't inherently like an evil person. He's basically doing what he's told to by his family in a lot of ways. And I love that the reveal is that very late in the film is it that you realize that he's not just operating alone, that he's not just some maniac in this house, but rather that he's just kind of defending his property almost in a twisted sort of way.
Yeah, and you get to the end, and we don't really understand what that whole kind of chainsaw ballet at the end is about. But it's so strange. There's sort of, like as you mentioned, like the opacity of his motivation is really fascinating.
And not just Leatherface, but the entire family are so damn scary. And we've mentioned that a little bit, that in the family moment at the dinner table, and we'll get to that scene because holy cow. But they each weirdly have this developed personality and this developed character that doesn't really require a ton of plot building, and you kind of know what trope each individual is, and I don't know, it's just brilliant storytelling.
One of the things that I think works the best for me among the Sawyers, because the first one we see is the hitchhiker son. We don't necessarily get a lot of his motivation. We know that he's the one who's stealing the bodies from the cemetery. That does come up when his dad is beating him out out on the road. The father figure is such an interesting character to me, and how terrifying he is in that, he keeps claiming he doesn't have a stomach for killing, but he is the one who's making sure everyone's dead. He's bringing victims to his sons. He's doing so much, and he delights in it, but then he backs out of the room for a minute, and then he delights in it and he backs out. And it's so interesting to see him kind of toe the line there of how depraved is he going to be.
Yeah, I think the hitchhiker, for me, I describe him as having like Renfield energy, from Dracula. Like, he just has that kind of like weaselly kind of thing that it's like a reprieve when you get him sort of expelled from the van, right? Only to end up in his lair with worse figures, which I think is so interesting.
Of course, we have to talk about Grandpa.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Yes, we do. Well, I love that the first time that we see Grandpa is when Sally is trying to get away. She runs upstairs and she sees, what appears to be two corpses of elderly people. We have the grandma who's definitely a corpse. But then we see Grandpa, and you think that he's a corpse too. And like and so I think it's all the more brilliant, when they bring him down the stairs, all of that, you still think that he's dead, and it's not until they cut open Sally's finger and stick it over so he can suck on it that he suddenly
Ugh.
comes to life. And to me, that's one of the most jarring and disturbing moments in the film.
Because we're genre swapping, because it suddenly seems like we're in a supernatural film.
Yeah, and it just throws you such a crazy curveball of like, this man is still alive somehow.
Right.
That maybe in spite of this awful, insane lifestyle that he's been leading for presumably, I don't know, like 150 years based on how old he looks. Good heaven, he's still alive. Like that maybe this is working for him. That this is the secret to eternal life or something.
Well, and yeah, I think that echoes what Andy was saying, is we are thinking this is like a slasher film, and then all of the sudden, it almost kind of gives off this necromancy type of a vibe.
Or vampiric or something.
Yeah, and you're just like, what the hell is going on? And it's jarring. It's so good, to the point where I didn't want to talk about the grandpa, because he's so gross.
Absolutely, yeah. But and then we have that insertion of comedy in that thing, in the moment where they're giving him the hammer to hit her over the head, and of course he's flaccid and he can't do it, which is an oddly comedic moment. That it's so interesting, but in some ways it's kind of classic because we have so much tension built up, and you feel like this isn't the time for comedy, right? We want to keep moving with the plot, and yet we have to deal with this strange, almost slapstick situation.
This is a little off topic,
yeah.
But again, I love how the movie was shot in 16mm. I think it adds such a beautiful dimension to this movie, and at some points I kind of felt like I was watching a documentary shot by Leatherface, which just kind of added to that illusion that this was inspired or based on true events.
Well, I think too, back to thinking about this as an allegory for the Vietnam War. Remember, this is the first televised war. It's the first time that Americans actually saw war atrocities on screen. And similar to audiences at home watching the Vietnam War, we're watching this and we're kind of paralyzed, right? We can't do anything to intervene or to help. We're just these sort of witnesses to the carnage.
We briefly mentioned this at the beginning of the episode, but I think that the poignancy behind all of this happening in rural America, this small little town. I mean, Ed Gein was from Wisconsin, even. Wisconsin. It's really kind of makes you take a step back and think about our country right now. And are these things happening? The depravity of man is out there. And what are people getting away with in these little towns and sadly in the big cities right now? The federal agents in Seattle and Chicago and everything. It's just, again, I think a testament to this movie is its staying power. It's relevant in 1974 and relevant in 2020.
And I think, too, just this sort of percolation of white working class anger in those spaces, right? Which now gets a whole sort of avenue through the internet of this sort of revitalization of white supremacy as a rejection of, I'm sure what they perceive of as Obama's America, right? And so I think that this idea that this is a film about going into retrograde is so relevant. And this is why I think of it as progressive horror. It's about the fear that the world will spin backwards, right? And that seems immensely relevant.
Moving away, I guess, from those much deeper themes, can we just talk about the practical effects of this film? Because wow,
so good. Holy hell, it's so good.
Just,
I mean, I have a lot of creepy stuff in my house, so I was low-key taking interior decorating notes. Could I use that skull as a candy dish?
That's right. Just scatter chicken feathers all over your sitting room.
I had a gentleman over on a date the other night, and he saw my satanic coloring book, and then 30 minutes later he had an emergency and had to leave.
Is that a real story?
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah,
my
that's a real
goodness.
story. This
Oh, my
happened.
God. You sent him right back to church.
That's right.
Another soul saved.
Oh, there we go.
Wow.
My mission isn't over.
It's
yeah,
what the opposite of praying away the gay.
Right, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. That scene where, not Sally, but the other female character, when she kind of falls into the sitting room, and I love how the camera lets us explore with her gaze all of the things we see, and it's left unexplained, and it's just a masterclass in production design, really, because it is so unsettling.
And you want to almost scream at the movie to say, no, stop.
What is
Let
that?
me.
Yeah.
Can I go look at that? What is
Right.
this? What's
Right.
happening? How did this happen?
Uh-huh.
It's just mind blowing. And later on in the episode, I'll kind of give a list of everything that Ed Gein had in his house. And it's just horrifying.
Interesting.
I guess, was there one particular decoration in the Sawyer house for Texas Chainsaw that especially disturbed you? Because for me, it was the lamp at the kitchen scene, or the headlight that was just, glowing skin with a face. That one just gets me.
And for me, it just sort of harkens back to sort of Nazi war atrocities and all sorts of things. For me, there is the couch made out of, I assume, human bones, although it's kind of indistinct. And I think that's kind of the point, is that animals and humans are kind of mixed together in this house indiscriminately.
Yeah, they don't really differentiate. They're all just animals to them.
For me, it actually comes from the list of items that Ed Gein actually have. I'm not 100% sure if they even have this in the movie, but he made a belt out of female human nipples, and it's just two things that you would never think should go together. Nipples and a belt. Why? Why?
Dumb question. He, as far as I know, only killed his mother, right? So he was grave robbing to get these things.
Right, yeah. Ed Gein is often misclassified as a serial killer when actually he was kind of borderline necrophiliac body snatcher. He only killed 2 people, so we know.
Well, let's save that for the Ed Gein section of the...
Yeah, absolutely.
Can we talk about the dinner table scene?
Sure, absolutely. And at some point, I'd love to talk about the sound design in this film. And maybe that's a good point to kind of bring that up in terms of what sound is doing for this picture. But yeah, the dinner table scene is horrific.
Part of what I think makes it work so well is just how often we see, like the way that it has time pass in this bizarre way of these close-ups and these panic shots, but then also just like the laughing and the kind of the twitching and the close-ups of the different faces. Like, you get to see them almost go through a whole meal, even though you don't necessarily see them sitting and eating that much. Like, it makes a very relatively short scene feel like it lasts forever, which I think was very effective. But yeah, let's talk about the sound design, because wow.
Beforehand, I just want to make mention that I think, Andy, you hit it on the head when we were talking about the nuclear family. And this movie, of course, is a product of the Vietnam War. And before this, the 50s and 60s, kind of that modern nuclear family was just so damn important to Americans. And then you have a scene like this that takes something that is so innocent in America at that time and perverts it. And it gets under your skin in such a simple way. That a lot of horror movies try to do and fail dramatically, taking something like a Christmas, for example, and perverting it into something that is completely what it should not be. And if a movie can do that, it's testament to its ability.
Absolutely. What's compelling to me about the sound, because I teach this film often in my intro class on the week where we talk about sound design, because I think it is a really compelling example of what horror can do. The thing about horror is that you can close your eyes, right? But you can never close your ears. You can never keep your ears from being assaulted. I feel like this film is an all-out assault on your ears. One critic, he called it not a soundtrack, but like a sound world. And what I like is that he said that you can't distinguish in this film what is Foley design and what is soundtrack. and it keeps moving back and forth between them, where the metal screeching turns into screams, and then back into metal screeching, and then into pigs squealing, right? And that all creates this sort of landscape where you can't even really identify what you're hearing. And that's part of the terror of it, is sort of the unidentifiability of the source of the sound. I was reading an interview with the sound designer Wayne Bell, who was really sort of like he worked boom mic and then ended up mixing a lot of things. But they asked him what he used for sounds, and he says that he used mostly children's toys, which I think is really fascinating. Let's see, cymbals, xylophones, shakers. They used a bass. He says, we just tortured that bass, which is really funny. We used a pillow pucking and rubbing various things on it. And it was really versatile. We got a lot of sound. Also, I learned that the animal noises that you hear in the film are actually Wayne Bell's father doing animal impressions. They're not actual animal sounds. Which is kind of uncanny.
Yeah, and it kind of makes me not ever want to meet that man.
right. It's like the actor from Police Academy who would do all the sound effects. That's what I'm picturing in my head.
Right.
But just the hellscape version of that.
Right, exactly. But I do love that. There's a machine that people use on horror scoring horror films called the Nightmare Machine. I don't know if you've ever heard of this.
It's one of my favorite things to watch YouTube's videos about.
It's so cool, right? But what Wayne Bell and Tobe Hooper are doing in this film is that they're creating their own nightmare machine, essentially, by using this double bass and rubbing things on it and creating these sort of otherworldly sounds. It really reminds me of the story about Godzilla's scream. I don't know if you ever heard about how they came up with that. Basically, they took a leather glove and coated it in resin, and then ran it up the strings of a double bass, and then sent that through reverb, and that's where you get that sort of scream howl of Godzilla. But it's cool because you can't identify it. You know what I mean? It's you don't know what makes the sound, and that in particular makes it eerie and uncanny in most like sort of basic sense.
Yeah, and with this film, it just makes it all very inhuman while it's very natural sounds. Mm-hmm. Like, it takes the normal and perverts it.
And that dinner scene in particular, when she's screaming, and if you listen, her screams turn into metal scraping and then into pigs squealing, and it's so strange, but it's so fascinatingly layered.
Well, and what you were saying, Andy, about kind of the ambiguity between the soundtrack and the special sounds, I think, again, harkens back to this idea that this movie, there's no rhyme or reason to the actions that this family's doing. And so it makes sense that the soundtrack and the noises that we hear, you can't make sense of what is what. Mm-hmm. It's just a whole other layer on top of this movie that just is incredible.
Do we move into maybe some things that we don't like about the movie as much, which might seem blasphemous, but I can kick us off.
I think that's useful. Yeah.
So to me, one of the things I actually struggle with was a lot of the camera work in the film. Sometimes I felt like it worked really well, but I felt like there were other times where we were just getting such bizarre angles and such like sharp, uncanny cuts that I didn't have time to actually like really see something that was horrifying on the screen. Which I at times felt like was just kind of a shame because like they did a lot of really crazy stuff with animal parts and all sorts of stuff, and I wanted to see it to be horrified by it, and there were times where I felt like the camera work didn't let me do that.
I wonder, do you have any thoughts? Was it just trying to be experimental, and some things just don't work when you try and do that, or do you think they were trying to mask things through these kind of quick edits or strange angles?
I wouldn't be surprised if part of it was just the fact that they were going for that PG rating, and so they were trying to show us horrifying things but not show it all directly. Like you said, it didn't have penetration directly on screen or things like that. And so I think some of it was just trying to edit it down in a way to make it work with the MPAA, because the classic stories that they try to go for a PG rating and then they got an X rating, and so then they had to cut it down a little bit to make it be R. And so to me, I think it's a combination of that and also just sometimes they just were trying things. They were just very experimental, and sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't for certain shots.
For me, I think two issues. They're not even really issues. I think they're kind of quote unquote cons that are actually pros for the movie. Is one, I think it is just such an iconic film that it can't be remade. I've seen a lot of remakes of this film, probably more than I've wanted to. And nothing comes close to the original.
Yeah.
I think
Do you mean literal remakes of this film?
Any sequels or any of those remakes.
Sure.
There's a freebie on Hulu right now. I think it was made in 2002 or 2004. But I just feel like nothing comes close to the raw depravity that Tobe Hooper was able to give us here. And again, that's not a con against the movie. I just think it's a legend, really.
Yeah, it's funny. I respect on a certain level the remake. What's 2011? I forget.
Oh, wow.
The Jessica Biel one, whenever that was made. Maybe it was 2001. But what I walk away with that movie is that it's just too pretty. For me, it's too slick. It's too polished. And what I find so terrifying about this one is that it does look like a home movie. It's just dirty and gritty and ugly. And I think the polish of the more contemporary remake takes that away from it. That kind of horror.
I agree. I also think that because this movie has just become so incorporated into the horror kind of zeitgeist, I always feel so fancy when I say that word, it kind of deters people because I think a lot of individuals hear Texas Chainsaw Massacre and they think Leatherface and the chainsaw and it's going to be this gory, bloody torture porn of a show. And so they avoid it. And it's a tragedy because, again, it's incredibly profound and everyone needs to see this movie if you like horror, if you don't, because of the societal implications that weigh it down.
One issue that I have with this film, and maybe how it's not aged as well for me, is its use of disability. So not just the sort of possible mental retardation of Leatherface, but particularly the character of Franklin is always really disturbing to me when I watch this film, especially in the opening scene of the film in van. They seem to suggest a commonality between him and the hitchhiker, right? In his obsession with the macabre, and then he becomes such an infantile character and annoying, right? That I think the film purposely courts a desire on your part to see him attacked.
Nathaniel has a lot to say about Franklin.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I agree completely, and along those lines, I feel like they made him such an infantile and obnoxious character that honestly, I think the first time I watched the film, I didn't really like it that much, just because I hated Franklin so much. Just there's almost a full minute of him just blowing raspberries at people, just that was just so immature and stupid and unrealistic that I don't know. Yeah, to me, it didn't understand that there's a difference between being physically handicapped in some way, that we have him, in a wheelchair, and then suddenly that inherently that he has to be, mentally deficient in some way or something like that. That I don't know. It felt like it was saying something that wasn't true or accurate or productive.
Yeah, and the way that they play his wheelchair rolling, off the highway for laughs, it's just he's really there to be the butt of the joke, and really I think it really instills in us a desire to see him eliminate, which is kind of weird for me from a modern perspective.
I guess to be fair, a lot of that has had an interesting impact in that a lot of times with slasher movies, especially what's coming to mind is a lot of the Friday the 13th films. They make characters that you love to hate, that you want to see them get killed, and so yeah, it's just kind of a weird choice to do that with the one character with a physical disability and
Absolutely.
I don't know. Yeah, there's definitely kind of a lot that feels problematic about him that's even hard to put into words.
I'm curious to hear other thoughts about what his character is even doing in this film. What's his function?
I keep trying to think of what is his role exactly, because I'm trying to look at it through the lens of like, this is, definitely being very critical of the Vietnam War and things like that. Is it saying that like, he is almost such a throwaway because he didn't have, an ideal human body, quote unquote, for being a soldier or being something like that, that even we don't like him because, he can't even be proper cannon fodder.
Sure. Or I'm thinking about how many soldiers came home from the war disabled, right? And there weren't any services to provide for them, and they were kind of left to their own devices, really. But then I don't really know what this film's doing with that, if that's the case, if I'm supposed to think of him as the allegory of the soldier come home from war, abandoned by his country. I don't really know. But the more troubling part for me is not so much that he's this sort of like feeble invalid, but that they really sort of suggest a sociopathology on his part, and a sort of commonality between him and the hitchhiker. I don't know what that's doing in the film.
Well, that commonality I don't think is only with the hitchhiker. I think if you look at Leatherface and the Sawyers and Franklin, everyone who is not kind of that cis normal American white individual is either super annoying or mentally unstable and a sociopath in the movie. And so I wonder if there is some kind of political tension behind that going on.
Yeah.
Should we rank this movie?
Oh.
Yeah, let's throw some ratings at this. So I can kick us off with that. So for screams, I would give this movie a 7. There are some really strong scares in the movie, but at the end of the day, because they pull back, I felt like the scary moments were very scary, but it takes a long time to get to the scares.
I gave it a 6.5. I agree. So 6.5. I think the horror behind this movie is a lot more conceptual and cerebral, which is important, and it can be terrifying, but like Nathaniel mentioned, a lot of the pulling away to try and keep it PG, I think, weakens the just sheer terror of the film.
Yeah, I'll agree. I think around a 7 for me. I do think it has some hills and valleys. Like I said, I find that opening scene of the hitchhiker one of the most disturbing sequences. And maybe that's it. Maybe I'm more disturbed by this film than I am scared.
Yeah.
It makes me very uncomfortable, this film. And another moment in the dinner scene, it's having her kind of strapped to the table is scary. But when they like go in on her white of her eyeball and just stay there, I find that so disturbing. And so, yeah, I guess this film fills me with dread more than it shocks and horrifies me.
Okay, so as far as crowns go, crowns represent how good of a movie we think it is. So again, it's a 1 to 10 scale, and I gave it an 8.5. I don't know if I've come close to a movie this good. Like Hereditary and Midsommar are some of my all-time favorites. And this is definitely up there. For people who are obsessed with the horror genre, you have to see this movie. It's, and again, even if you're not a fan of horror, it's just such a powerful and poetic movie.
Yeah, I also, I'm going to give it an 8. And honestly, the gap between, that and being perfect is mostly just rooted in Franklin being just not.
The enigma.
Yeah.
I'll say the Crowns is what, like its importance,
or just
how good of a movie.
Good movie.
Yeah, just quality of film.
I don't think it's without flaws. I think we really don't know much about Sally in this film. I think the character development is pretty thin. Especially for the young protagonist. I feel like it needs a little bit more in the third act than her escaping the house and going back, into the house. So I'll give it an 8 in terms of script writing.
So now that we have ranked the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, should we talk about one of its biggest inspirations, Ed Gein?
Yeah, I would love to talk about serial killers. One of my favorite pastimes. It's fine. It's cool. It's normal. So yeah, Ed Gein is one of the most iconic serial killers, I think, too. Well, again, he's not really a serial killer, but I'm going to probably use that phrase quite a bit just to be succinct. So Ed Gein, let me just pull up my notes here, make sure I don't forget anything. Like I mentioned earlier, he was born in Wisconsin in 1906. So incredibly early as far as America goes. Of course, the country had been well established for a while, but in Wisconsin in particular, very, very backwards, very conservative, very religious. Think of every stereotype you know about 1906, and it applies. He came from a very difficult family. His mother, Augusta, hated his father. His father was very lazy, an alcoholic, couldn't keep a job for anything, and she came from a very kind of prominent family in the area and was very haughty and prideful and insulting to his father and also insulting to a lot of the townsfolk. If you didn't like it the Augusta way, then you were in the wrong and she was always in the right. And because of this, she isolated herself and her family for a very long time. Ed, when he was little, kind of had these weird tics. He would repeat himself often or think out loud, kind of whimsical, quirky things that kids do. And Augusta would absolutely not allow him to make any sort of friends. If he brought home friends, they were turned away. She would ridicule them, insult them to the point that they just would not hang out. And on top of that, she was very religious, outrageously religious, especially in terms of morality, chastity, sexual expression. Of course, that being 1906 doesn't help this situation. And so there was a lot of toxicity in the household of Ed Gein, and his brother passed away very early on in his life, and a lot of people think he actually was Ed Gein's first murder. That's still unconfirmed. Then his father passed away, and so for a long time, it was just Ed Gein and Augusta. And eventually, she had her first stroke, which rendered her essentially incapacitated. So Ed Gein was spending 24/7 with this woman who was essentially dictating how he lived his life. And ultimately, she had another stroke and died, leaving Ed Gein this amazing and large house in the middle of Wisconsin. And so there's a lot of psychology that we can go on from here, especially with the toxic mother, and we could even go into, queer identity and development. But of course, the hallmark of Ed Gein is when Augusta died, his life was shocked and rattled, and eventually led him to kill 2 different women. He's only been charged with killing 2 people, and in order to be a serial killer, I think you need at least 3 in a certain period of time. So, more so, Ed Gein was more of a necrophiliac / body snatcher. He would recall waking up in a graveyard covered in grave dirt, exhuming the bodies of women close in age to his mom. He would then take those body parts back home and do his taxidermy stuff, and make all of these different things to fill his house with: furniture, clothing, you name it, he essentially had it. And towards the end of his career, I don't want to call it a career, but let's call it a career, he divulged to authorities that really his motivation here was he never felt good in his own skin. He never felt he identified as a man or a boy, or he always wanted to live that kind of feminine lifestyle to the point where he wanted to make a woman suit from these corpses so he could literally crawl into the skin of the woman he loved most, which was his mother, Augusta.
Definitely, you can see how that had some inspiration for the Buffalo Bill character of Silence of the Lambs.
So the authorities, and you can Google search a lot of these images, and disclaimer, it is very, very graphic. I mean, I come from a biology degree. I've seen about everything, and seeing some of these pictures, it gets to you. The list is a bit extensive, so bear with me here, just because it is pretty wild what he created. So a list of things found in his home: whole human bones and fragments, a wastebasket or garbage made out of human skin covering several chair seats, skulls on a lot of the bedposts, female skulls with some of the tops sewn off, bowls made from human skulls, a corset from a female torso skinned from shoulders to waist, leggings made from human leg skin, masks made from the skin of female heads, a face mask in a paper bag, a skull in a box, an entire head in a burlap sack, a heart in a plastic bag, 9 vulvae in a shoebox, a young girl's dress and vulvas of 2 females judged to have been about 15, a belt made of female human nipples, and 4 noses. And just one other thing that I think is very indicative of what was going on with Ed Gein is he mentioned to the authorities when he was captured that he would dress up in all of this regalia and go outside and dance and sing and pretend to be female, wearing this suit of human skin.
Oh, you had 3 more things on your list on the next page. A pair of lips on a window shade drawstring, a lampshade made from the skin of a human face, and fingernails from female fingers.
Oh, thank you.
Just some real disturbing things that I had to throw in.
And Andy, I kind of want to get your perspective on this.
Sure.
Just with you and me being queer individuals, Dahmer and Ed Gein are 2 iconic horror individuals who I think, had they had proper LGBT resources and counseling and the ability to express themselves in a healthy way, could have overcome a lot of this kind of macabre behavior. Would you agree in some regard?
I mean, I don't know. It's tough to say. I would like to separate queerness from psychopathology. I think that link's been pretty firmly established by conservative forces.
Absolutely.
So it's tough to say. I mean, what we're talking about with Ed Gein and Dahmer is a sort of lack of empathy, lack of understanding of human beings as people, right? And seeing them as just things, and that seems to me separate from any concerns over sexuality. Certainly, repression is the monster in this story. But I think that these are deep psychological issues that have to do with their ability to empathize with other people. That being said, I mean, it's tough looking at this, this sort of evidence, and it seems irresponsible to make a profile of Ed Gein as transgender. And even Silence of the Lambs wants to be, and Psycho both, are at pains to kind of divorce them, right? He's not a transvestite, he blah, blah, blah. Is obsessed with his mother. I mean, this seems like a particular pathology in both of these cases. Yeah, I'm remiss to do armchair psychoanalysis of anyone. But yeah, it's bizarre and it's sad, and you wonder kind of what was going on in your head.
Sure.
That would kind of allow for these things. We talked a little bit about My Friend Dahmer, right? The graphic novel and the film that was made. And we see early on, even before you would say Dahmer, kind of like his adolescent hormones turned on, he had this sort of macabre dehumanization of animals and people, right? Of the sort of lack of empathy. And I think that that's at the core of what we see in serial killer pathology.
Definitely, and I think you bringing up that at the end of the day, it has little, if nothing, to do with other aspects of who they are and their sexual preferences or things like that is important, because I feel like so often, especially hyper conservatives, they will try to tie those together so often, and that's just not fair or accurate.
Right. And part of the demonization of queerness in the genre is that it used to be that the killer was queer or bisexual or transgender, and then you wouldn't have to explain anything else. You would say, like, oh, the killer wants to be a woman, and they're like, oh, okay, well, of course they're a psychopath. No more explanation needed, right? And I think that, thankfully, we're at a point where we don't accept that as a rudimentary excuse for pathology. There's a comedian, Eddie Izzard, who has a bit of his routine where he goes into it. He's like, there's a crazy homeless man, and they discover women's shoes in a cave he's living in, and they go, that explains it. Transvestite. And he goes, no, fucking weirdo transvestite, right? let's crowbar those two. I'm an executive transvestite. That's a weirdo transvestite.
Oh man, I love Eddie Izzard so much.
I do too.
As do I. So good.
And just a random tangent, he was also so good in Hannibal. So
Oh
good.
yeah, I loved him as like a dollar store version of Hannibal Lecter. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh man, he's the best, and everyone should just appreciate him for his amazingness.
Yes.
Andy,
So-
if you have a few more moments, we want to kind of dive into this video
Yeah.
game.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I
Daniel,
really
hit
want to hear what you have to think. Okay, so we decided to tie Resident Evil 7 Biohazard is the full title of the game, which is a game from 3 years ago. So it came out in 2017 in January. Because it is in many ways a tremendous love letter to Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Where am I? What the hell?
Rise and shine, sleepyhead. It's time for supper.
Who are you people?
Eat it. It's good.
Dumb son of a bitch wasn't no good if it hit him.
Lucas!
Damn, old man, not again.
Get out the way, Marguerite. Hit boy's got to eat. He got to have his supper. Come here, boy. Let's do this. Come on.
Oh shit, oh shit, oh shit! He's not eating it, Jack! He's not eating it!
Shut the hell up,
I
Marguerite!
made that for him!
Get the hell out of here!
You're a son of a bitch! Oh, I can't believe it! You son of a bitch! He's not eating it! He's not eating it!
This was supposed to be a very special feast. Come on, boy. Welcome to the family, son.
And so I'm going to give a few points that kind of just, I'll give a very basic plot summary and then also hit some points of kind of how it's very different than a lot of the other Resident Evil games, because most of them are just kind of, zombies. Before I dig into exactly how it how it's so connected to Texas Chainsaw. So the plot summary is that basically you are playing as a man named Ethan, whose wife has gone missing. She was like working as a nanny several years prior to the events of the game. Just like disappeared off the face of the earth. And then you get an email from her saying, basically it just has an address out in the middle of nowhere in Louisiana, just out in the bayou, and it just says, "I'm waiting for you." And so he has to know what happened to his wife, and so he goes down there and immediately just gets to this property where there are corpses of different animals used as decorations, and everything is just filthy and awful and disgusting. And so he just kind of breaks into this house that's actually like a side house of a much larger property, and finds his wife, and she's very confused as to why he's there. And she's just like, no, like, you can't be here. You need to get out of here. And then suddenly she just like turns really like savage and starts attacking him. As the result of the attack, she actually cuts off his arm with the chainsaw. So our first nod to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But and then suddenly he gets attacked by the person who is the patriarch of the family that owns the home, who goes by Jack Baker. He just says, "Welcome to the family, son," and then punches you in the face. And then you wake up after someone has reattached actually someone else's arm to where your arm got cut off at this dinner table where you meet the family, and it's directly a huge tribute to Texas Chainsaw Massacre at this moment, because there's a big feast prepared for you to be joining the family, but it's all just like decayed, disgusting, awful food. They're fighting amongst themselves. The key family members is we have Jack Baker, the patriarch, who's like a 60-year-old man. Then we have his wife Marguerite and their son, who are all just fighting with each other. And like Lucas says something that pisses his dad off, and his dad just like cuts his arm off. Like he just gets a carving knife and just like cuts it off. And so, but the entire scene is set up, and also you have like grandmother looking character that is just like who might be a corpse just sitting in the corner of the room. Like it's very Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And so what you learn, because they suddenly, get a knock at the door from a police officer, and so they have to keep things quiet. So most of them leave the room. Is that this family has been infected by something. There's basically this little girl who came in and just like infected their brains, all of that. But just the design of the buildings, the design of just that they have body parts as furniture, and and that it combines the animal and the human, and all of that is a huge part of what makes this place seem like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Even like the design of the house, the layout is very similar. Like when you go upstairs, it looks much nicer, like what happens in Texas Chainsaw Massacre with the Sawyer family. And so it's really interesting to see all of the ways that it nods to Texas Chainsaw Massacre over and over and over again. Sometimes very overtly with your arm getting cut off with a chainsaw, or that the dinner scene especially. But these people are very deranged. It feels almost like a modern update of the Sawyers in a lot of ways. But in many ways, this is also a big departure for the series, because as I mentioned, most of the Resident Evil games up until this point dealt with zombies. And so what we have in this one is different monsters that are called the Molded, which kind of look like just like weird spiky monster, like humanoid monsters that kind of like can come out of this goo that's all over the place. But also, we have
is
these.
It spread like mold?
It's similar to like mold or things like that, but these monsters are presumably made up mostly of other people who have come on the property and then have been taken over. But for some reason, this family is all partially these Molded, but partially something else. Because like they, like I mentioned, the son literally has his arm cut off, but later on it's grown back. You have to go up against these family members multiple times throughout the game, and you'll kill them, and then they come back in different ways. And so there's definitely this kind of unstoppability of these characters. One of the first major conflicts is getting chased around by the dad of the family, Jack, having this really crazy fight with him in a garage, and then later on, there he is again. He's back again. He's chasing you again, and so it's this kind of persistence of the same sort of characters over and over and over again. And I think what makes it such an effective piece is it does a lot of things that nods to other things in the series. The first game in the Resident Evil series is set in a mansion. And so, we this is also set in a mansion, and it has like nods to some specific puzzles and things like that are very iconic for the series. But it's a big departure because this one is in first person, and as opposed to being a third person game, which is every other entry in the series has been. Because it really just it lets you experience basically Texas Chainsaw type horrors firsthand. And in fact, they even went as far with the PlayStation version to offer it in a VR mode, which is just too hard to handle for a lot of people, because it's brutal.
I have yet to do a VR horror game.
And this one is easily probably the scariest in a lot of ways. But the monsters are interesting and unique, while it still is just this love letter to everything Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The buildings are dilapidated. It's basically, what if Texas Chainsaw Massacre were happening on like a the bayou with a huge mansion, and each family member has their own things that they're doing, but it's just terrifying and wonderful, and to me it's one of the top examples of horror video games in general, but also just as it's super impressive as a piece really designed for fans of the horror genre in general. I think it's truly amazing. Like, if nothing else, Andy, you should just look up the Resident Evil 7 dinner table scene. It's like 2 minutes on YouTube, but it is jarring, and it's, to me, it takes the Texas Chainsaw Massacre dinner table scene and almost makes it more violent and worse in a lot of ways. But yeah, so that's Resident Evil 7, and I definitely recommend it to anyone who likes horror video games. I honestly think that, maybe shy of one or two other horror video games like Silent Hill 2, among the very best ever made.
Oh, wow. Well, I'm reading up a little bit about this. I wrote a whole book on evil kids, so I love a little evil child in horror movies. So this is really fascinating.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, I think you might quite like it because the family gets corrupted by this kid. They were a very happy, normal family up until that point.
And it's interesting. I like when something takes its influence and understands it. And I think Texas Chainsaw Massacre is about this like pathological need for family and this sort of image of family. And I see that that's kind of at the heart of this too. Is this girl Eveline is obsessed with creating a family?
Yep.
So that's really great.
And I guess I'll put a little spoiler warning here for people who want to play the game and haven't. But the old lady that's at the dinner table is actually Eveline. Like, you don't find that out until much later in the game. But yeah, she like ages at a bizarre rate and stuff. But yeah, much of it, you just think that she's a child that's gonna pop out at some point. But then turns out she's actually the old lady that's been just floating around the rooms the whole time.
So don't trust kids or old people.
But I love that that just this like invalid old lady is also really the one who's pulling the strings in a lot of ways, which is another nod to Texas Chainsaws.
And does this fit back into the like greater mythology of Resident Evil? Like, do we see the molded appear in later iterations?
Well, so this is the most recent game, and they have just announced an 8th entry into the series where the main character is going to be Ethan again. This also ties into the other games in that late in the game you see some references to Umbrella Corporation, which is the ones who created the zombies, and also at near the very end of the game, Chris Redfield, who is one of the protagonists in many of the games, ends up coming in. And then there's also like a DLC, probably about 5 hours long, expansion called Not a Hero, where you play as Chris Redfield going up against Lucas, the son of the family. He manages to escape in the game. So
was this girl, was she intended as kind of a bioweapon that escaped?
Yes.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, so she's a human bioweapon basically, and so that's kind of how it ties into that bigger mythology of trying to make bioweapons, the Umbrella Corporation and all of that, but it's kind of, hey, this is someone else's bioweapon and it's way, way worse, but it kind of ends up being in a fairly limited area. And another thing that I think is actually really cool about it that I didn't mention is that there are actually sections of the game where you play as Ethan will find like a videotape and put it in, and then you play as like someone holding a video camera, like, so it feels like found footage sections of the game where it has the kind of the grainy VHS feel to those sections of the gameplay, where you don't have a weapon for those. You just are going around, looking around, with a video camera, and it's really jarring as well, and definitely has a few nods to like other significant horror films like Blair Witch Project specifically. But yeah, it's quite the amalgamation of a lot of really great horror.
All right. Anything else we want to say about Leatherface and his lovely family?
No, I would just say, just like a little plug here, I think I do a kind of a movie night for friends, and recently I did The Loved Ones, which I think is also an interesting take on Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and also share some of that DNA of just like characters obsessed with tradition and family and rituals to the degree that they will force people to participate in them. We see that certainly in The Loved Ones, an Australian horror film.
Which I think we need a full episode on, Andy, because as you are well aware, I loved this movie.
I have a lot to say about it. It sounds like you do too.
Ugh, it was so good.
But I describe it as Texas Chainsaw Massacre by way of Heathers.
Yeah, I could see that. Should we call it a show then?
I think we should. Once again, Andy, thank you for being here. Do you want to give just one more plug of where people can find you?
Sure. So my website, the easiest way to find me, ADScahill, SCAHILL.com. I'm trying to keep that up to date. And then I'm on Twitter, Andrew Scahill. So either one of those places would be great to find me. And my book, if you're feeling like you want to know more about evil kids, is The Revolting Child in Horror Cinema, Youth Rebellion and Queer Spectatorship. And
speaking of websites, we actually now have a website just for our listeners to be aware of. So it's just screamkingspodcast.com. So if you want a good place to find all social media feeds, all a bunch of different ways to listen to the show, find our merchandise, anything like that, go ahead and check that out as well. But I guess if there's nothing else to say, we should just say stay spooky.
Need even more Scream Kings? Here's our obligatory shameless social media plug. Follow us on Twitter or Instagram at ScreamKingsPod. You could also email us at screamkingspodcast@gmail.com. Help us reach a wider audience of horror fans by leaving a review on iTunes or by sharing a link on social media. You can also support the show by going to patreon.com/ScreamKings. Stay spooky.